Welcome back to the Practice of Being Seen podcast, episode number 29. Today's show is brought to you by Medify, a self-awareness app created by therapists that will help you be your best self. Download it for free today on both Apple and Android devices. The practice of being seen is about understanding who you really are and daring to share your truth with the world. This is a conversation with and for seekers, creators, and holders of transformation. We believe that stories shape relationships, and relationships shape stories. I'm your host, Rebecca Wong, relationship therapist and founder of Connectfulness. I'm joined by my co-host, Marisa Gowdy, writer and storytelling coach for healers. This is the practice of being seen. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. And now, the show.
Today we're lucky enough to have Janice Levy with us. Janice is a professor in the Department of Media, Arts, Sciences, and Studies in the Roy H. Park School of Communications at Ithaca College. An acclaimed photographer, Janice's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally in museums and galleries, including Cornell University and the Museum of Antigua and Barbuda. Her photographs and writing have been widely published in textbooks, magazines, and online. Among her many awards, Janice won first place in the 2016 International Photography Awards Family of Man competition in the marriage category. And she also won first place in the prestigious 2013 photo review competition for her photographs of Saudi Arabia.
And 20 years ago, Janice was one of my professors and advisors at Ithaca College. And so it is with great pleasure that we welcome you today, Janice. Hello and welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here and so glad that you thought of me. You've been doing such wonderful things, helping people, connecting people, doing all of that stuff. Hats off to you, really. It's not easy to do that.
No,
it really isn't.
It's interesting, though, because I often look back at my days at Ithaca College and all of the artwork and the film and the photography that I did back then. And I feel like a lot of that was a preparation for me to do the work I do now.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how photographs and film can do that. I spent a year in Saudi Arabia as a sabbatical, and I had the opportunity I was invited actually to teach photography at an all-women's university there, Princess Noura bint Abdulrahman University. And I took the opportunity, and it was really a life-changing experience for me. But I'll just skip to what happened afterwards quickly to feed into what you had just said. And when I came back, I started to look through old photographs as a way of trying to connect my experience in Saudi Arabia with what might have happened as a child that would have led me to accept that invitation. How did I get there? And, I think that sometimes we look at our historical past to try and figure out what were the relationships that you could see in those old photographs. How could you sort of connect your history with where you are now? If you learn how to read those images, which is, of course, what it is that you learn when you're studying film and photography, what are the messages that you can see in the way people stand in photographs and the expressions that they give and the body language and all, where does that take you? How do you put together those pieces? And oftentimes, particularly after a traumatic event, or if you're searching for something, you look at those old pictures and you say, okay, what was it in the way my mother and father interacted in those old pictures that could lead to, either their breakup or their happy marriage, or, how did I stand with my sister that can give me some information about our relationship now? And it's really fascinating.
Yeah. I think of that so often in my work. When I'm sitting with couples, when I'm sitting with individuals, I'm always picking apart little things that I'm noticing in their body language. And
right.
It totally goes back to the photography classes I remember taking with you, and just like how people stand and what it means. And each little shift of weight has meaning.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting to me because I have students. Ithaca College accommodates a lot of students with disabilities, and I've had over the years students that are on the spectrum, and they will come to me after the first few classes and they'll say things like, I can't really read somebody's expression. So, when you say, for instance, that you'll have to, take a portrait of somebody and interpret what they're feeling or thinking by looking at the expression on their face, they'll say to me, well, I can't do that. And it's so fascinating to me to try and talk to them about other things that they could do to make images that'll, either formally or in some other way communicate something that they can't do because they can't recognize the expression on someone's face as being indicative of a certain feeling. But it always takes me back because, I rely so much on things like body language and facial expression in my work to communicate things.
Yeah. So is it okay with you if we dive in a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead. Dive away.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So, you briefly mentioned your own dive into looking at your family photos. I'm curious what's come out of that for you.
Well, a lot, actually. I mentioned I spent a year in Saudi Arabia, which was probably one of the most difficult experiences of my life and probably one of the most fulfilling in a lot of ways.
Maybe we should slow down and give you a chance to tell us about that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was in 2010, 2011, and it was actually my second trip to Saudi Arabia. The first one was in January of 2010, and it was a brief 2-week consulting job where I spoke to deans and chairs about leadership. And while I was there, I found out that the college or the university was looking for a photographer to teach for the following year in their new College of Art and Design. And I had a sabbatical coming up, so I thought, wow, why not? I mean, it was an amazing opportunity. And I had been treated very well during the workshop. And I thought that people had a lot of misperceptions about Saudi Arabia based on how I'd been treated in my 2 weeks there. So I went for it. And I thought, it would be a really good opportunity to understand more about that part of the world and also to work with young Saudi women and give them a vehicle for exploring their world and communicating through images, which is how I always used photography, as sort of, a reason to be there. I used to say to people, my students, that, for instance, you wouldn't knock on someone's door just randomly and say, hi, I'd like to come in and learn all the intimate details of your life, because you'd get the door slammed in your face. But, if you knocked on someone's door and said, I'm a photographer and I'm photographing everybody who lives on Main Street, can I come in and take your picture? Chances are that they would say, sure. And in the course of the time that you spent with them, they would tell you all the intimate details of their life, which to me was the interesting part. But I thought that, wow, Saudi Arabia, here is a very new medium in that country. There was a law against photographing in public places until 2006 in that country. And I thought this would be, to be the first person to teach photography in a public university in that country would be something, really interesting. So anyway, I went. And what I found was something very different than what I had experienced during the 2 weeks that I was there. And that was that, I was living basically on the economy, as they say, and I was not in a sheltered compound like most foreigners are, So I was living basically in one little room surrounded by men. It was more or less a pretty uncomfortable environment for me. And the teaching itself was really fascinating. My students didn't speak English very well, so I did this kind of pantomime for 6 hours a day. But what it did was it sort of challenged everything that I ever believed in terms of, taking for granted freedoms that we have here, freedom of speech, freedom of movement. Women aren't treated very well in Saudi Arabia. I lived in a kind of, in order to survive, I dissociated pretty much for the entire time that I was there. I felt like I was in danger. First of all, I'm a Jew, and I kept that hidden because there's this hostility towards Israel, which translates to hostility towards Jews. And there was this feeling that I had all the time that if I were discovered, that my life would be in danger. And that wasn't just a feeling, it was actually true, because comments, for instance, one day I was in class and I had shown a photograph of a Nazi soldier that August Sander had taken. And I was talking about portraiture, and one of my students said, "What's a Nazi?" And another said, Oh, like a Nazi like Hitler, who was a really good man because he solved a very big problem. And, I just sort of stepped off the podium and said, do you think that killing millions of people because they believe something different from you is a good way to solve a problem? And, we talked about it. So I was very honest with my students, but they had been educated in a certain way.
You were opening dialogues, though. You were building bridges.
Yes, I was. And, the thing that was so amazing to me was that in the end, the students said to me, you not only taught us about photography, you taught us about life. And to me, that's why photography is such a powerful medium and such a powerful tool because, photography isn't just about taking pictures. It's about exploring life. And I've always felt that photography is the vehicle for understanding life. And, the taking pictures part is, to me, it's almost like a really small part of it. It's the excuse to explore. It's the excuse to think. It's the excuse to be certain places. And in a funny kind of way, if I look at my whole career, the actual physical photograph for me, the artifact, has been far less important than the experience that has produced that artifact. The artifact is the validation in a way that I was there and I can look at the picture and I can say, right, that sort of validates the way I think, or that's the reminder, or that, it's the memory jolt or whatever.
It reminds me of that whole idea of you have to live the story before you can tell it.
Exactly.
And emphasizing that living part is what really opens up the story you're telling, the end product, what someone's eventually going to be absorbing and taking into their own lives.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned that because here's the thing that concerns me most about what's going on in education now and going on with my students. I've been teaching for 30 years, and what I see now in our students, and I've seen it now for the past few years, is this fear of living. And, it's actually a fear of everything, but I think, now that you put it that way, I think it's just a fear of living. They are fearful of every experience. They're fearful basically of doing what they would describe as the wrong thing. And I say to them, it's like, what is the wrong thing? What is it that you're so afraid of? And I think in part it has to do with their education, the sort of teach to the test thing where there is only one right answer. And, if they don't give the right answer, then somehow they're punished in some way. I don't know. I mean, I'll tell you right off, I don't have children. I've never had any of my own. But they seem to have this, I will confront them and I'll say, what is it that you're so afraid of? And they can't even answer that question, but they'll say, we don't want to do the wrong thing. And so they don't experiment. I mean, I recall when I was in college and afterwards, I was willing to try anything. Even if I thought that, first of all, I never thought that I couldn't do it. Even if I had never done it before, my approach was, how hard can it be? Other people do. And it's not that I ever thought I was so brilliant because I didn't, which is another thing that we can go into. But I always thought, like, what's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is that it won't work. And then I'll either figure out how to make it work or I'll go on to something else. But students these days don't have that attitude. They only want to take the safe route.
And I think, I'm guessing in many ways that the students that you're seeing in this evolution over the past 30 years that you've seen progress to this point is kind of like a microcosm of what we're seeing in society at large.
Yeah, I think it is. And so when you say you have to live the story to tell the story, it's like, what is the story that they're going to live? What stories are they going to tell? I think that I have had, good and bad experiences, and I've always learned from them, and even the worst of them. And I will tell you that Saudi Arabia, in many ways, was, and I don't want to say it was the worst of my experiences, but it's the one that I emerged from the most. And I don't want to say damaged, but it has taken me years to recover from that, and I'm not fully recovered yet. And I tell people that what happened was that when I came back, I had to, my DNA had completely, split apart. And I had to sort of reconfigure my DNA. I had been so shocked by the experience, by what I had seen, the hatred, the xenophobia, just this sort of the fear also, the inability to think critically, the acceptance of what somebody said just because that person said it, the non-questioning, the kinds of things, by the way, that I see going on in our culture today. And that's why it scares me so much that it took me at least 2 years to sort of come out of the place that I was in when I came back. And that surprised me because I often thought that, I could throw anything at me, I can handle it. That was something that I couldn't totally handle and didn't realize it at the time.
What's interesting is you're talking about this kind of deep inwardness, this fear, this inability to feel like they could ever be wrong. And that's coming at the same time as we're seeing this huge democratization of an ability to take images, because we all have cameras in our phones and we have information everywhere, and that there's this rush of what seems like it should be so empowering, and in fact, it's deeply disempowering. And that's such a paradox.
Yeah, it's very interesting because in a funny kind of way, and I saw that the democratizing effect of photography, and certainly in the sort of Arab Spring, in terms of its ability to communicate. I was over in Saudi Arabia when the Arab Spring happened, and I saw it also in an interesting way when I went to Guatemala in 2013, was it? To relearn Spanish so I could give the keynote address in Spanish in Panama for an organization. That's another long story that I'll tell you about. But one of the things that was interesting was that when I had been in Guatemala in 1991, you couldn't take photographs of anyone because they were all saying, give me money in exchange for taking a picture. And when I went down there this time, many years later, nobody cared if you took their picture. And the reason was that everyone had a cell phone. So a photograph wasn't a commodity anymore. And so it didn't matter if you took their picture because they could take their own picture. Yeah.
I'm curious because, when I was in school with you, we were still in dark rooms. We were still developing film. Everything was still really, really tangible. And since I have left photography school, I've not picked up a camera. I've not put a roll of film in a camera in God knows how long. And there was so much intent behind everything. Like we were using 4x5 negatives. Like everything was...
Slows it down.
Yeah, it slows you down. It makes you really, really plan and think about every little detail and see things on a deep level.
Yeah, but this is why I think, and I want to get back to the whole disempowering thing about taking pictures all the time, but because I think that what it's done is, and I hate to use these sort of pat phrases, but it's created a culture of narcissism that is so despicable. I think what it's done is it has created this sort of superficiality about photographs. I mean, I think in some ways it has empowered people because people who wouldn't have access to making pictures before now do. And they can instantly put them on the web and people can see things that they never did before. And in a lot of ways, I think it's good. But I think what's happened is that it's sort of cheapened the image also in a lot of ways, because what you said, it's like when there was film, it sort of made photography a little bit elitist in a way, because you had to have a significant amount of money, first of all, to have a camera, to be able to purchase film, to have it processed. You had to have certain facilities in order to make the prints or enough money to have somebody else do it.
I just have to break in for a moment. As I was researching your work before our call, I was looking through some of the pictures you'd won awards for. And I was looking at the International Photography Awards. And I was like, Rebecca, stop. I have to look at these for a second. I'm like, can you look at these with me? She's like, no, I'm working. But it was that moment.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And it was just that moment of saying, wow, these are different than what I see every day in my Instagram feed. And there is that moment we can still, I hope, create that space to say, this was created with a different level of intention and seeing than the rest of us mere mortals have access to in that moment of taking a snapshot.
Yeah, I would like to think that my vision is different, but it's so hard these days because, if you look at, IPA and some of the other sites, there are so many amazing photographers out there now. It's not like it was in the 50s or 60s. There are some incredibly talented people. doing amazing things. And, I'd like to think that my vision is different. But that's why, in a funny kind of way, it's really nice if I can stick with this idea that it's not the destination, it's the journey. Because if I was really, really preoccupied with the final product and being recognized by the Museum of Modern Art for my photographs, then I'd be really depressed. But I will tell you, this is sort of interesting. As I get older, I'm at a point now where I'm sort of looking back on all my work. I'm not running around as much as I used to, and at a point where I'm putting it all together. And I'm thinking, now's the time to really get this stuff out and try and get some recognition for all of the pictures I've been taking my whole life. So maybe that'll change.
But it's also like what I'm hearing even in that statement is it's my whole life, right? It's like it's the culmination, it's the curation of all of the experiences that you've had. It's not any one experience, it's a longer game.
Well, it is. And that's the interesting thing about getting to be, I turned 60 this year, and I don't really pay too much attention to age. And that's because, when you're a college professor, it's like your kids never grow up. They're always 18 to 21. If you're a real parent, you sort of get to age because you see your kids growing up and you think, oh my God, if my kid just turned, 30, then I must be at least 50 or 60 or whatever. But because my kids never grow up, I always think that I'm 35, right? So,
you are.
And if my but if my health stays pretty good, then, I can stay 35 forever. But you do get to a point where you start to think, you just see the pile of negatives or the number of external hard drives increase, and you think, my God, I have all this work. And it's time to sort of look at the trajectory that it's taken. But also something very interesting happened in 2014. My father died. And he was 90 years old. And what we found after he died in his garage was thousands of negatives and a lot of documents. And he had never told me about all of this work that he did, because basically most of the work that he did was top secret. And he had taken an amazing number of pictures when he was in the war in China, Burma, and India from 1944 to 1947. And the work was just amazing. And it was taken with a square format camera. And the pictures are just phenomenal. I think he's a better photographer, or was a better photographer than I am. And so, first of all, I was incredibly angry after he died. So angry, because he had never told me about these photographs. And when I got to, I've scanned all of them now, all of the World War II photographs, and I'm scanning the stuff that came afterwards. And I put together a book of these images, and I'm going to start sending it out to see if I can get it published. It's called Over the Hump. But what I found was, like I said, I was so angry, but as I delved deeper into the documents, I found out that he was a major advisor to all of the presidents, but mainly to JFK, John F. Kennedy. And he worked for NASA and for the CIA. And so he couldn't really talk about any of his work.
What was that like for you? You said you were angry, but
oh my God,
to discover all these pieces of, this man he was your father, how much more intimate can a relationship get, right?
Well, yeah, but it's interesting because I realized that the whole thing is so interesting. And again, I feel like just as I start to try and recover from one experience, I get hit with another one. This one was very difficult for me, but sort of ironic because, my whole life I've dealt with illusion. Photographs are illusion. You're really creating something that, in a sense, is based on some sort of fantasy. Even if you're a documentary photographer, and I sort of consider myself in that mode, but you're still the image that you create is based on your perspective and what you were feeling and thinking at the time and your interpretation of a particular situation. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it is illusion, right? So here I am in the business of creating illusions, and my father was also an illusion, because he wasn't the man that he pretended to be. Conversations with him were like, oh, nice corn, where'd you get it? And oh, my steak is really good, that kind of stuff, because he couldn't talk about anything else. And I always suspected, when I was a kid, that something was up because, I was a very perceptive child. And we did spend our early years in Paris. He was a Minister of Defense to NATO in the Kennedy administration and McNamara Secretary to Europe and the Middle East. So I knew that he had some government work, but I had no idea, for instance, that he was Teller's right hand guy, and that he had done all this work with the hydrogen bomb, and that he was a big arms salesman, and, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I had no idea of the depth of the work that he had done, but here I am reading all these letters and that he had kept, and he kept everything. And I'm thinking to myself, and I'm looking at these photographs of these, hydrogen bombs going off, and I'm feeling like, it's like this man that I didn't know. And then I hear from my stepmother during a conversation that he thinks that my father for the past 30 years had thought that I had also been a spy of some sort. And then I'm really shocked because I'm thinking, oh my God, for 30 years of my life, we've been doing these dance around each other, like these conversations that we had when I would say, oh, I'm going to Guatemala. And he would say, why do you have to go to Guatemala? And I would say, I'm doing development work. And he would say, why can't you go? And I realized that these conversations were this like sort of weird dance that we did and that we never really connected, and then that really upset me because there was, again, this sort of illusionary kind of relationship. And it was just, the whole thing just came crashing down on me. So then what I decided to do was try and find him by following in his footsteps. And a couple of summers ago, I drove out to New Mexico and Nevada, and I went to the Nevada testing site, and I stood where he stood. And I'm sorry if I get upset, and took pictures of where he had detonated those bombs.
Oh, Janice.
Yeah. And so now I'm putting together a book that I call Atomic Love Poem. Yeah. And it's going to juxtapose my photographs of these areas, which are still radioactive, hardtack too, and places where he was, and pictures of us growing up. And there'll be like a juxtaposition of those images along with documents and other, sort of, it's about America's love affair with the atomic bomb. Yeah.
Oh my. I'm excited to see that.
Yeah, me too. It's like, it's hard to work on. Obviously, it's very personal, and it involves some of that looking back at those images that I looked at. It's interesting because everything sort of comes together in strange ways. When I got back from Saudi Arabia and I started to look at these family pictures, my parents divorced when I was 11. And so when I started to look at these pictures of us when we were kids and how we were always standing in a certain way, who was close to my father and how my parents stood in these pictures. And, did it predict something in the future? And I mean, I was born in 57, and these pictures at the dining room table or at the Seder table or something when, my father the next day run off, to the Nevada testing site to blow up something else. It's like, it makes me sick when I think of it. And also for him, it's sad because, he never really was able to participate in our family life. It's very complicated. And there were thousands of other men just like him. And I say men because they were mostly men. But so I have a lot of research to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm talking too much.
Oh, no, you're not. I think we're so drawn in. But I'm also struck in thinking that so many people, so many of us go through a very similar dance. It might not be on the same degree or the same level of not knowing the people that they have intimate relationships with, the people that they're close with. But that dance, that feeling of not really knowing, that's such a common experience.
I think especially with relationship to your parents, because I think that parents don't, again, and I don't know because I don't have a child, but I think parents hold back a little bit maybe with respect to their children. But I would encourage, I talk to my students about this, about the discoveries I made with respect to my parents, and in particular my father, because I share this work with them. And, a lot of them say, well, my father works for Raytheon, and I say, which is a big defense contractor. And, I say, ask your parents about their work while you still can, and maybe they'll share it with you, because finding out after they died is sometimes really difficult, So I encourage them to do that.
And this is bringing to mind for me that idea of protecting and what may be done theoretically. This is for your best interests. I'm protecting you. Just feeling there's a resonance in, help me understand how that comes into the act of taking photos and cataloging time. Protection. Where does that come into all this?
How do you mean exactly?
I'm not even sure. It's that element of, thinking about the stories I don't know of my own father. I think there's that desire to protect my daughter from understanding, potentially shadowy places or the worst of anyone that any father may not want to tell a daughter.
Yeah.
And where is that kind of photography?
I think part of it is protecting, but I think some parents think their kids aren't interested, but I think that protection is a big part of I don't want to say ruined this generation, but I think that parents are overly protective of their kids. And, I see that obviously with my students and the number of times they call their parents. And, I think that that's a result of, the 9/11, obviously, and also with that little boy, God, now I can't remember his name. Anyway, the little boy, he was 6 years old and he begged his parents to be able to walk to the bus or to school alone in New York City. And he was abducted, and he became sort of the first big public abduction, and he was killed. And his case was recently solved.
Yes, after 25 years, right? It was a long time.
And I think parents became much more careful about their kids after that. But I think the extent to which, and then there became the whole helicopter parents thing. But, my parents were much more hands off. Although my father, interestingly enough, when I look back on it, was very, very protective of us. And I think it was because of the work that he did. When other kids were allowed to walk around the neighborhood alone and stuff like that, we were not. And I now recognize the extent to which we were probably watched. There were people that came into my life that I now realize were probably planted there as a result of my father's work, ways in which I was watched throughout my college years and after. You start to put together your life in a very different way after you find out certain things.
There's an interesting irony in being watched and then becoming a professional watcher and recorder of what goes by you. It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the whole irony of it. And, if I spend too much time thinking about it, I can really make myself crazy. And luckily, it's sort of like, and this is hope for people later in life, I met this wonderful man a couple of years ago, and he really keeps me balanced. We got married and we have this incredible life, and he doesn't let me go to those really dark places too often. He keeps me focused on the day to day. And there's something, to be said for that, because there's so many little dark places you can go to,
As you bring up your husband and you bring up this idea of marriage, I'm thinking about that photo that you won the award for, and that you won it for the yeah. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that experience and recording was that in Madagascar?
Oh yeah, Madagascar. Oh my God, I love Madagascar. I first went there in it's like mad about Madagascar. It was one of those places.
Were you first there in 95 or something?
No, much earlier than that.
It
92, 91, 92. Yeah, 92. I went there in 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, and then 2001. And I had gotten this fellowship with the Kellogg Foundation, and it was a leadership development fellowship that lasted for 3 years. And I was teaching at the same time, but I got time off for that. And it allowed me to travel, and I was looking at issues of family planning in developing countries. And basically I did some globe spinning at that point. And I looked at the map and I said, Madagascar, wow, that looks pretty remote. And I found out that they had a population that had doubled since the French left. They were decolonized in about 1960. And so I went there. And the minute I stepped off the plane, I just had this feeling that I belonged there. And there was something about the quality of the light and the smell of the place, and it was just amazing. So I went back all of those years. And the first time I was there, I spent only 3 weeks there. And it was way too short a period of time. The place had no infrastructure. It took ages to get any place. And the people were so warm and welcoming. Like I fell in love. So the next year I went back and I spent 3 months there. And then I spent a sabbatical there, and I just kept going back. And then I took students there in 1994, I think. And then I headed up the School for International Training program there in 2001. The way that picture came about was that I became friends, obviously, with lots of people who lived there. And one of them was a journalist. And that was his parents. So we went to lunch there one day, and I wanted to take their portrait. And they got all dressed up for their portrait after lunch. And I saw that picture, and that was his parents, and I asked them to stand underneath it, and I took that picture. And the irony of submitting work in that category was that this is my third marriage. I had two really disastrous ones before this. And I said to myself, after the second disastrous marriage, which fell apart right after I came back from Saudi Arabia, was that I said, oh my God, I will never do this again. This is like so not for me. And then, of course, I met my current husband, and it was so clear that being with him was so perfect. You know, you say never, 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 and then you meet somebody and it's like, oh my God, this is so right. But yeah, so then when I submitted that in marriage, I thought, how ironic that I would submit a photograph in the marriage category of all categories, the thing I disdain the most, you know. And here I am married again, so never say never.
Yeah, sometimes we need to try things multiple times to find the right fit.
Right, as I say, three's the charm, you know, or never give up.
Three's a pretty magical number.
Yeah, it is, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. Never give up. You know, my favorite saying is, do one thing every day that scares you.
Oh, I love Roosevelt. That. Yes.
Yeah. And it's really funny because I've taught abroad a lot, and one of the places is in Antigua, in the West Indies. And anyhow, I taught a group of students, Antiguan students, as part of this government project. I taught them photography. And there was one student in the class who was very, very shy, but very talented. And I said to the whole class, I said, you know, do one thing every day that scares you. And this was a number of years ago, and I just heard from her. And she sent me this email, and she's now studying in, get this, Siberia, and she's getting her baccalaureate. And she said, you know, I remember always that thing that you said, do one thing every day that scares you. And I decided to pursue my baccalaureate in Siberia. And some days I'm so shy, and it really scares me to get up and walk to class. But I remember that you said that. And so here I am, and I'm going to get my degree and go back to Antigua. And I was so touched by that.
You make an impact all the time. I remember, and I'll just get a little bit personal for a second, that I was going through a particularly rough time when I was in college. I had lost a few of my family members who were really, really important to me. And it was through our relationship, Janice, you were my advisor at the time, and through our relationship that you pushed me into seeking the exact support that I needed at the time. So I just want to kind of reflect that back. And I'm pretty sure that myself and this other student that you were talking about, we're not the only lives that you've transformed.
Well, thank you. I mean, I like to think that I make an impact. You know, it's sort of like when I was in college, I had an advisor who did the same for me. And, you know, I think college is a really difficult time for a lot of people. You know, for most, you know, it's a time where you're trying to figure out who you are and how much of what you grew up with you want to keep and how much you want to toss away, and coming into your own. And it's difficult. And, you know, I always said that I wanted to be able to be for my students what my advisor, Rick Hertz, was for me. And, you know, I like to think that I can do that. It's, you know, thank you for saying that. You know, sometimes it feels like sort of a thankless job, but you know, I think that's exaggerating. It hardly, you know, sometimes it's exasperating, but it always feels really worth it. I still love it. You know, after all these years, I still love teaching. I do. I really do.
You're an amazing teacher.
Well, thank you.
You know what I'm just so appreciating in this conversation, as you know, you two have had that one-on-one relationship, small in a classroom, probably in a dark room together. And then we're talking about that level of detail and one-to-one connection. And then hearing your stories, you're also zooming the lens so far back that you have me imagining the entire globe. As I jot down the countries we're mentioning right now, I feel like we've traveled to pretty much everywhere around our world. And there's such richness in seeing that both and space of so small and so vast.
And this is what stories do for us, right? Like, we often talk on our podcast about how stories shape relationships and how relationships shape stories. And I think in this conversation today, you've really helped us illustrate that.
And that whole idea of the universal is found in the specific.
Yeah, it's true. Stories are what it's about. You know, it's about all those oral histories and stories being told and through generations and generations. And, My father had some great stories, stories about the war, and, you just remember stuff. And it's such a wonderful way of passing down your richness, really.
And images are another way of storytelling.
Yeah, they are. They really are. And I hope that the digital phase, I hope that these images last. They're telling people now to make prints because, once you move on, no one's going to be going through your hard drives. They will go through boxes of prints, but they're not going to go through your hard drives. So make sure that you make prints. I tell my students never to erase anything, because you're going to want to look back on the images that you made early on to see the connections that you're going to make 20 years later. I mean, they're always there. The connections are there. You just have to make sure you don't throw away the early stuff.
So that you can rediscover
there are
those
things that I
connections.
see. Yeah, you have to rediscover, because when you're young, you feel like everything's throwaway. You don't see the value in the stuff that you're doing when you're young. But when you have a perspective of 20, 30 years and you look back on it, you say, wow, look what I was doing then. And I didn't value it, but I can now see the thread. That was like the beginning. That was the first knot that I made, like when you're hemming your pants.
Yeah.
Like the first knot that you make. And you got to keep that knot there. Otherwise, the whole thing will fall apart.
Make it possible to rediscover yourself.
That's such a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to keep that. Yeah, I'm writing that down.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm a lifelong journal keeper, and I have kept every single one of them.
Me too.
Yeah, and I wonder about, there's those who say they have ritual burnings of their journal, and it's very much part of their, it's a kind of a thing. It's part of their process of maybe especially in a very hard time of life of cataloging something they found really difficult. And to me, I always just said, I never could. They all look, these little black books are all lined up in a cabinet. And heaven forbid / I hope someday someone reads them.
Yeah, somebody will. But has anyone ever read them that you didn't want to read them?
Not that I know of. I've never experienced that violation.
Your children are also not quite old enough yet.
Yeah. I'm starting to get a little smarter about where I leave them.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I've had people read my journals that I didn't want to read them, and that's been painful. It's very interesting to read. I'm starting to reread parts of them, and I could have written them today. That's the really scary thing. Read something from 30 years ago that you could have written. Oh, that's weird. Yeah. Then you think, oh my God, how much progress have I really made? You think you're all evolved, and then you read something that you wrote 30 years ago, and it's like,
Or you say, my goodness, I was a wise child, and you just embrace yourself.
Yeah, I think I'm going to write that down too. I was the one to embrace myself. Yeah, that's a good idea.
This has just been so rich and so wonderful. Thank you so much, Janice. Janice's work was recently selected for an exhibition at Milk Gallery in New York City. She'll be there for the opening on Thursday, August 10th of 2017 from 6 to 8 p.m. Do check our show notes for a link to the gallery. And once again, today's episode is brought to you by Medify, a self-awareness app created by therapists that helps you to be your best self. You can download it for free today on both Apple and Android devices. One of the things that I love about Medify is just how accessible it is and how it really helps you to walk through the process of sitting with your feelings, especially if that's not something that you're really accustomed to doing or are comfortable doing for that matter. So many of my clients are starting to use Medify and bringing it back into sessions to share with me what they've been noticing, because that's really the work of all of this. It's noticing your feelings. So on the Medify app, you'll be able to either name a primary emotion or notice where you're feeling it in your body or make a little journal entry about that emotion. And it's just another really great way to start noticing what you're feeling. Because truly, that's where the practice of being seen begins. Seeing yourself. And so on that note of seeing yourself, Marisa and I are both pivoting and noticing different aspects of ourselves that we are leaning into. You can listen to episode 28 for more about that story. I'll be releasing another 3 episodes that Marisa and I have recorded together over the next 2 weeks. And then we'll follow that up with one more interview that I have recorded alone. And then I'll be taking a few weeks off from the podcast, probably 2 to 4 weeks off, and returning sometime in September of 2017 to begin season 2 with you. And I hope that you'll join me there as well. As always, for more great content, check out practiceofbeingseen.com and help to spread the word by subscribing, rating, and reviewing our podcast. Music written and performed by Christopher Farris and produced at Kidney Stone Studio.